Thank you, Kelly, for that introduction. So, such a privilege and really a blessing to be here, to be able to discuss calling and vocation. I can't think of very many places where I could do that, and also, honest to goodness, be able to say that I'm able to have the freedom to work that out. So I'm very grateful for a place like Hope College. Quick poll. If maybe my clicker is not working. That's okay. We'll go further here. So I have a question for you all. So students often come into my office, and maybe this is like pre-registration advising. Maybe it's just a one-off kind of thing where folks come in. Maybe it's to choose an area of study, what to major in, discuss choices or goals. They often feel stuck. That's a sentiment that I hear sometimes, that I feel stuck. And I'm curious, this is a non-scientific poll, and this is completely based on my own anecdotal evidence, or anecdata, as economists recently have been starting to call it. Okay. What is the modal reason they give as the reason why? For those of you for whom statistics has been a little while, modal is the most frequent response. So which one of these is the most frequent response that I hear? What do you think? Raise your hand if you think it's nothing interests them. Raise your hand if you think that they have too many interests. Raise your hand if you think their interests do not align with their family's expectations. What about they don't know how to use their interests and gifts and how they can make them earn a living? Okay. So here are a lot of these. Well, it turns out if you answered number 2, you can go to your next class and beg them for extra credit, because you're right. You're right. This is what I hear most often. Now, I actually hear all of these things. It just happens to be what I tend to hear most is this one. They have too many interests, right? Too many interests. I can't narrow it down. All of these occur, but I have too many interests, and I can't help but thinking, what a beautiful problem to have, right? Should we all be so lucky to have that and continue to have an abundance of interest? So the liberal arts education involves both a broadening and a settling in. So broadening and settling in. And maybe I feel so strongly and I resonate with these students so much. It could be possibly that I just pick up on these more because I resonate with it so much, right? Because that's my story, right? I had these broad interests, these deep interests. It's my experience as an undergraduate. I don't actually remember disliking any class as an undergrad, but I remember not being good at some, right? I remember saying like, this is not for me. I'm going to do the best I can and then get out of here. So I was convinced for a while, actually. There's a class on the philosophical theology of C.S. Lewis through his writings. And that class, it told me and convinced me that I was a philosophy major who could read literature deeply, right? And a class called Nietzsche and the Novelist convinced me that I wasn't, right? And so liberal arts can do this for you. It can help you expand. It can help you broaden. I'm grateful for even the Nietzsche class, right? But it also helps you to narrow. Right? It also helps you to narrow. I was at a small school, Bethel College, Indiana. There are some folks who are at a less prestigious Bethel University in this room, but I went to the one in Mishawaka, Indiana. It was a small school. It allowed me to lean into my callings. It allowed me to say, hey, I think I want to try on philosophy. It allowed me to say, hey, philosophy is not for me. And so for the rest of the talk, I want to talk about how the liberal arts can help you to become who you are called to be, And I'm going to do that through my own story, my own lens. I'm going to talk about becoming an economist. I never became a speller, as you can see. So, but I did become an economist. So you can see that I missed the D there, right? I'm going to talk about doing the work of economists. So becoming an economist, doing the work of an economist. And I want to talk about being an economist. And I'm going to specifically talk about that at Hope College. And I hope that the story can kind of resonate with all of you, even though I'm only counting 1, 2, 3, 4 economists in the room. I don't think this is unique to my discipline. But I want to show you my way of my path through it. Okay. So that's kind of the outline. So as I mentioned, I started my journey at Bethel University, a small liberal arts college. It allowed me to explore. Right, I wound up in econ because I had taken some AP classes in high school, and I passed them, and I said, well, why not? Like, I'm already partway there. But along the way, as I was exploring different paths, I was an international ministry major for a while. I thought maybe I want to do missions. My time at Bethel taught me the world is truly a wondrous place. And one way that you can lean into your calling as a creation of God is to use academics to explore it. It's not the only way, but it was the way that the Lord brought me. Eventually, the economist identity stuck. I took more and more economics. I realized that if I was ever going to do this economics thing beyond undergrad, I need to take some math. So I stopped broadening. I shouldn't say I stopped broadening. I continued to broaden, but I also started to settle. I said, okay, what does it take to become an economist? And the answer, one of the answers is more math. So you take math. You take lots of math. And I ended up with a double major in math and was able to minor in Spanish. So what happened? As I moved through my time at Bethel College, I graduated. I got married. Everybody turned around and wave to my wife Hannah in the back corner. It produced a couple daughters. One of them is with her back there, Sarah. So after my time in undergrad, I moved to Billings, Montana, which is the landscape right up there on the top left. I worked in software development, used some of my quantitative skills. I enjoyed the job. It was exciting to be out on my own. I started to volunteer at a place called the Adullam House. Right? The Adullam House is a place for individuals coming out of incarceration, and these are folks who had severe and serious offenses. Drug offenses, yes, theft offenses, but also homicide offenses, sex offenses. I started to meet with these folks. This is a Christian organization that housed these men. I engaged weekly Bible studies, had meals with them, regular coffees with the guys in the house. I learned about their struggles to lead a decent job, to save enough for their own place, while at the same time navigating the labyrinth of hearings, of court-ordered treatment plans, parole officer check-ins. What are the struggles of getting back on your feet after involvement with the corrections system? I also saw men be successful, earn money, strike it out on their own, get a good job, right? Find housing. And I saw men relapse, and I saw men turn back to drugs. I saw men in a variety of ways turn back to some old patterns of living. It made me curious. why these things happen. There are a variety of explanations, and a lot of them are good, and a lot of them are not good, right? Lots of social scientists have talked about this. Why is it that people engage in criminal behavior in the first place, and why do they return to it after being punished in some way? I remembered my calling and vocation that I felt in undergrad, and my interest in economics. I remember that economics has a little bit of something to say about human behavior. And I say a little bit. I think what I'm saying is that there's a lot to say about human behavior, and it's not the only discipline, to be sure, but it's the discipline that I found, and it's the discipline that I was called to. So that led me to go on and say, I want to know a little bit more about this. I love software development, actually. I love software testing, but it's not going to help me answer these deep social questions that I'm interested in. And I remembered thinking like an economist. I remember the ideas that I had in my undergraduate education and how that spun off into these really interesting conversations and really interesting explanations about how people make behavior. And so these are not the only ways that econ contributes to our thinking, but the tools of economics are very, very powerful. Okay, some highlights, again, without the math, right? There's some theoretical contributions. These are the three that I think, if I could give you and walk away with, I think they're sort of maybe the most key. The first one is marginal thinking, right? This idea of marginal thinking. It's this idea that decisions are made based on additional costs and additional benefits of an action. Right? Incentives matter. Costs matter. Benefits matter for human behavior. Opportunity cost, the second one. So the cost of an action includes not just a monetary cost or the cost of physically exerting something or your energy, but also the value of foregoing the best alternative of taking that action. Okay, another example would be markets. Another one in market tend to clear. Markets tend to clear. What do I mean by that? Does anybody like these pens? This is a Pilot G2. Does everybody like that? Would anybody want to trade for this? If I asked you for $5 for this pen, would anybody, the price maybe is too high, so what about $3? Would anybody pay me $1 for this pen? No. 50 cents. Does anybody have 50 cents to spend on this pen? We'll make this trade. You say sure? Oh, okay. All right. If you have 50 cents, we'll finish the deal afterwards. There you go. 50 cents for that pen. So we just did an auction, and the market cleared. So markets tend to clear. There's a price for everything, generally speaking, and markets tend to clear. This is a powerful insight that we can use, right? So markets tend to clear. There's also a bunch of empirical contributions, and we'll get to that soon. But I want to move on from that, because this is what motivated. This is what got me into continuing into economics, right? It's this idea that there's these powerful insights. So I continued on, and I got a master's degree from Montana State University, because I was already in Montana. Bozeman, Montana is just a few hours to the west of where I was. And actually, our apartment was something like right there. And so, I dream about this still a lot, actually. So this was Bozeman, Montana. This is Montana State University. And there, it turned out that there was a really nice shop of applied microeconomists there. And I didn't know it at the time, because all I knew about was I liked the economic way of thinking. And I said, I want to become an economist. I want to keep becoming an economist. And so I leaned into it. And the folks there are applied microeconomists. And they taught me not just how to think like an economist theoretically, but also to use the tools of applied microeconomics to ask and answer these social questions. Okay, so I added this third piece. So economists tend to care a lot about causality. Okay, what is causality? It's this issue that you can see two data sets, you could see two time series in a row, and they could be together, and you could see them moving together. It doesn't mean that one's causing the other. Economists have become obsessed with teasing out causal identification, teasing out causal relationships and separating them from merely correlation, right? And I fell hard as well, right? So I became an applied economist. The lens through which I view the world came to be through these theoretical contributions that economists make, but also through statistical techniques that I use to identify causal inference. I think you should, again, my wife is here, you should ask my wife all the day long, I think, wow, that would be a really interesting natural experiment. I wonder if anybody has done that. I'm curious if that effect is causal or if it's a mere correlation. I was becoming an economist. That led me to the University of Pittsburgh, where I completed my doctoral work. So as my skills increased, my technical skills increased, my knowledge of the empirical strategies in microeconomics increased. I realized I just kept wanting more. So I decided to continue down the path of academic economics, was motivated by the way that the discipline sought to answer social questions, right? So it led me down a path of research that asked deep questions about public policy. I started to return to those questions that I had earlier. Why is it that people decide to commit crime when it doesn't seem rational as you might understand it? Okay, why do they return? So I continued on. My broad interests as a liberal arts student, that really hasn't changed. I have broad interest. I still have broad interest. But I've settled into my identity as an economist as I've become an economist. In many ways, that's why I'm an economist. Because an economist, as I can travel down this path of scholarship, I'm able to enter into many different questions. In many ways, the tools and methods of economics are just as much part of what it means to be an economist than the topics. So broadly, my research fits into kind of two buckets, right? The first one would be the impact of public policy at the individual behavior, and I especially focus on at-risk populations, right? And what do I mean by that? I mean folks who are particularly exposed to the effects of public policy. This would include people returning from prison. This includes people in prison. It also includes refugees who are recently settled and have a very, very, very exposed situation. And I also studied the impact of religion and religious phenomenon on economic life. So what does it mean to do the work of an economist? So I want to briefly chat about a recent paper that I've written. And this is this idea of subsidized housing and its impact on reincarceration probabilities. So we know, or at least we think we know, from lots of social science research, and these are not economists, that stable housing seems to be important for successful reentry out of prison. Right? This is somewhat obvious in some sense, or it seems like it could be obvious in some sense, that stable housing is a prerequisite in a lot of ways for successful reentry. At the same time, returning citizens are at particularly high risk of housing insecurity. There's a variety of reasons for that we could talk about. Some of it is housing market. You could think about it as housing market discrimination. You could think about it as market exclusions. There are some legal exclusions for certain types of people living in certain types of housing. A whole host of reasons. Housing also it provides access to employment as well, right? Housing it provides access to employment. It can lower mental strain, and also this idea of opportunity cost, right? It can increase the opportunity cost of criminal behavior. A stable housing situation means that if you land yourself back in prison, you lose that housing situation. So this can increase the opportunity cost of doing criminal activities. So on the other hand, our current housing policy is moving away from this, but in the past 30 years has largely focused on placing individuals in disadvantaged neighborhoods, right? The subsidized housing that we've developed in this country often is located in disadvantaged neighborhoods. Okay, so what is the effect of subsidizing housing? What's the effect of providing that opportunity for people? When on the one hand, it's important for successful reentries, presumably, but on the other hand, if that housing is located in disadvantaged neighborhoods, you might actually have these adverse effects, right? It's true that returning prisoners already disproportionately move to these environments. Okay, does our subsidized housing policy perpetuate that? And then what are the effects of it? So this was the question that I sought to answer, we know really little actually about how our existing programs do that. But the subsidized housing, our situation in the United States of providing public housing and voucher-based housing can both could potentially offer a solution. And I'm not going to go into details on these policies, but just give you a little bit of a flavor for what that is. So Andy told me that I can't go into methodology, and I wanted to respect that.
Go to what you want. I just
well,
want to follow.
What I was gonna say is that Andy said I couldn't go into methodology, and I respect that. But I'm gonna go into methodology anyway. Not deep, not very deep. I just want to, and I don't have a whiteboard anyway, so I'm somewhat restricted in what I would do. But okay, so the question is, how does availability of subsidized housing affect the probability of return prison spells? And so when I'm curious, I want to use the variation availability of public housing. These are units that are provided by the government for individuals, and not specifically coming out of prison, just anybody within a certain income threshold. And vouchers. Vouchers work a little bit differently. They're basically like a subsidy you can carry with you, and you can give it to a landlord, and then the government will make up the difference between what the landlord is paying and 30% of your income. And so what happens here is that individuals are released from prison, and they're released from prison at different times. Sometimes they're released from prison into a county that happens to have a really high wait time for public housing in that moment. Sometimes they're released to that county or a different county when there happens to be a smaller wait time. The line for public housing is smaller. And so what I do is I say, okay, if the timing of release is unrelated to local subsidized housing conditions, if that timing is released, what we can do is we can use that as a source of random variation and say, well, okay, that is actually not related to their release, right? Subsidized housing is not their housing conditions is not related to the timing of their release. And we use that as a source of random variation, and so the average wait time experienced in a county during the year of release can be treated with some caveats that we'll go into as a sort of a random treatment shock. Okay, and so what do we find, or what do I find? So greater accessibility of public housing at the time of release is associated with an increased probability of reincarceration within 3 years. Okay, what is this saying? It's saying that when housing is more accessible, then you have an increased probability of reincarceration. How does that make sense? Well, it makes sense if that second story is at play. If the second story is at play, if individuals are returning to areas that are highly concentrated and highly disadvantaged economically, or depressed economically, you might have what we call criminogenic effects of these public housing situations. Okay. And I test for that. I say, let me look at these counties where public housing projects are located in economically depressed neighborhoods. And then let me also look at the public housing projects that are located in wealthier and more well-off neighborhoods. The effects are entirely driven by concentrated public housing. They're entirely driven by these counties where public housing is concentrated in a few units, where the density is large, where they're located in geographic areas that are economically more disadvantaged. There's also no effect on vouchers. The reason is because vouchers, you can take the voucher, you can move wherever you want. You're not constrained to a location. So these results suggest that concentrated public housing may actually increase the rates of reincarceration. And what's the policy implication here? Is let's disaggregate, right? Let's not build any more concentrated public housing, which is what the Department of Housing and Urban Development has been saying, or has been trying to say for years. This result supports that conclusion from an angle of reentry and folks coming out of prison. So this is what the I have to show a graph, of course, right? So this is what we see. These are the effects. These are the recidivism rates. The effects on the recidivism rates. 6 months after release, 12 months, 18, 24, 30, and you can see the effects kind of peak 3 years after, and they kind of dissipate later on. And these are the aggregated effects, and the effects get a little bit larger if you just look at these disadvantaged areas. Okay. So my other work, I'm not going to dive into everything, but there's a purpose, there's a reason why I'm going to tell you about these. So my other work touches on topics that are maybe not necessarily conventionally considered in the domain of traditional economics. At least by non-economists, right? So one example would be revelations of abuse in the Roman Catholic Church actually had negative effects on a very important vulnerable group that's settled by charities associated with the Catholic Church, refugees. So it turns out when refugees are settled in areas that were recently that had recent abuse allegations come to light, these folks tend to do less, and it's because people tend to donate less to social services after that point. Larger refundable tax credits reduce religious service attendance, right? This actually implies that religious involvement has a social safety net feature that we could talk about offline if you want. But I actually find this good news, and as a Christian, it means that we're in some sense doing what works. I also have work that says gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering, reduces voter turnout, right? Redrawing gerrymandering districts actually also undoes this effect. So each of these papers uses the theory and the tools of economics to answer what I hope are important social questions. Now, topically, I've kind of stepped on some toes here, right? So there's a large literature on social service provision. The social work literature is very deep. Refundable tax credits, the sociologists of religion might get a little bit. I hope that I didn't say anything too untrue, right, or too much of a Philistine there, because they know way more about the ins and outs. Partisan gerrymandering, I actually submitted this to a poli-sci paper at first, so that's kind of a poli-sci paper, right? That seems like a poli-sci paper. Okay, so it turns out that I actually think that economics in some sense is the ultimate liberal arts discipline. I don't mean ultimate in the sense that it's the best, don't worry. I don't mean that. Steve thinks so. I don't mean that. What I mean is that for those of you who have broad interests, economics is a really nice place to go to scratch your itch, right? There's broad interest. There's broad interest. Now, especially if you're interested in the social sciences. Let me say that. Okay, so being an economist at Hope. Why do I bring that stuff up about stepping on other disciplines' toes? Well, so here's a chart. This is from a paper that was published not too long ago in an Oxford Handbook of political science methodology. So this is papers that were published in the top 5 political science journals using fixed effects and difference methods. Okay, so what are fixed effects and difference methods? I'm not going to go into it in detail. Again, Andy said I couldn't. But what they are, these are statistical techniques used to uncover causal identification that originated in economics and statistics during what became known as the credibility revolution. It's this idea of trying to uncover causal. It's basically you're trying to say, well, we can't run randomized controlled trials, so let's try to back that out, looking at something that naturally happened, just trying to find some sort of natural source of variation. The paper I told you about uses a form of difference. What you can see is that from 2000 to 2022, the amount of papers that use this technique has skyrocketed. And this is for political science. This is particularly true in political science. You'd see something similar in sociology as well. Disciplines that are looking at phenomenon that are difficult to test in the lab. Okay. So empirical methods originating in the economic discipline have been steadily increasing over the years. This presents some pitfalls, I think, as an economist. Right? And I worry about these. Like I worry about neglecting insights from other disciplines. I worry about ignoring nuance in human decision making. I worry about prioritizing quantitative over qualitative data. And yeah, you could probably think of other ways that I'm messing up the social research, right? But the fact remains that I'm an economist, and I think that's a really good way to do scholarship, right? And I think being a psychologist, I think being a sociologist, and I think being a political scientist are really good ways of doing social science research, right? And so, what's the antidote? How can a young man keep his way pure, right? How does an economist like me avoid these pitfalls? And I think it's dialoguing with community. I think it's leaning in my case to but for the scholars in the room, in your case, lean into your scholarly identity. Lean into your discipline. Encourage other people to do what they do well, right? So this community of scholars lets us do that. It provides a space to act out, for me, my calling, incorporating the insights into other disciplines. Now, I don't mean necessarily that will show up in my writing all the time. I don't necessarily even mean interdisciplinary work, although I think that's valuable. What I mean is that the dialogue itself is valuable. It's valuable for our students. It's valuable for distinguishing yourself as a scholar in your own field. So I'm invited, you're invited to my calling as an economist, your calling as a scholar. For students, your calling as students. You're invited to lean in to your calling, to dive in deeply to your calling while being in the community at Hope College. So there's something going on here that just reminds me of the doctrine of the incarnation. This idea that Christ took on flesh, right? He put on he put on flesh, and he came and dwelt among us. And I think there's something like that that's going on in scholarship at a liberal arts college. There's something like maintaining your identity, leaning into your identity, pursuing excellence in your identity, and going and rubbing shoulders with people who have different scholarly identities. But it requires you to do both. It requires you to lean into that identity, but it also requires you to lean into that calling and to that community. And what I mean by that is, so my identity as an applied microeconomist requires me to be several, more than this probably, but several things at once. One is a social scientist who uses methods of my discipline, but also lives among the discipline, the questions of other disciplines. Right? The questions I ask have already been asked by other disciplines in a lot of cases. But also as a scholar, Hope College asks me to be both committed to the guild and connected to the scholarly guild, but also committed to really, hopefully good work. And also live and serve students and I think too the broader community, and to live into that. So Christ had something, again, he had it much harder, right? When he juggled the dual natures of divinity and humanity. But man, do I find inspiration, and man, do I look to his example to try to, in some imperfect way, live out that. I think Paul also sort of agreed with this, right? Paul said something like this. He said, to the Jews I became a Jew in order to win the Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win to those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became the weak, that I might win the weak. And I become all things to all people, by all means, that I might save some. So I think what's interesting here is that Paul is hitting at this idea of incarnational ministry, and I think scholarship can do something similar. Living incarnationally as a scholar requires you to lean into your community. Again, for students, your vocation as a student requires you to lean into your classes. It requires you to, literally to take these anchor plan classes, but I think if you take vocation seriously, you take those classes seriously. And I don't mean to sit there and stare at you guys. I know you're up front, and thank you for that. But I think that's important. I think you need to lean into your scholarly identity, right? If you're a psychologist, you're a psychologist. Lean into that identity. We need that. I need that in this community. Right. That's actually why, I don't know if you noticed, this looks different than PowerPoint. I created these slides in LaTeX just because that's the professional norm in economics to do. Why is it harder than PowerPoint, and is it kind of silly to do it? It is, but that's what economists do for some reason, and I'm an economist, and so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to lean into the discipline. And lastly, it's to be humble, right? You cannot live incarnationally as a scholar. Or anything else without a healthy dose of humility and love for one another. So my prayer is that Christ would be glorified as we seek to live into this vision of community, as scholars, as learners, as students. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Silveus, wonderful presentation. He teased me quite a bit about methodology in this, but what I simply meant is that if Neil went deeply into the mathematical principles behind his research, I was going to need some of his intrepid intermediate micro students to sit close to me and explain stuff. So fortunately, we've got a lot of time to get deeper into these questions about your work and about this wonderful presentation. Who has a question or would like to ask Dr. Silveus something?
Thank you very much. As a non-economist, I could follow this, except one thing I don't understand. What's the refundable tax credit, and how does that impact religious attendance? Oh, yeah,
great question. So a refundable tax credit, I maybe could have written that in a different way. So the earned income tax credit is sort of the best known refundable tax credit. And what this is, refundable simply means with the tax code that you can you can take that cash. Probably it doesn't just give you a tax break, but you can also take that as cash on your tax return. So the earned income tax credit is sort of probably the most famous example of this. Certainly, maybe the most important policy-wise. And what this is, that's actually one of the biggest transfer programs. It's just administered through the tax program. So if you fall below a certain income threshold and you also earn money, you can actually earn more income tax credit the more you work up to a certain point. It plateaus, and then after that point, the credit starts to phase out a little bit. So basically what this works like, the generosity, the amount of the credit varies from state to state, and over time, that's changed over the years. Different states have sort of put more tax credit on top of this. Some states have taken it away. And so the paper that I referenced a little while ago, what that does is it says, okay, well, let me compare folks who look very similar, but happen to be at a state and time where there was a more generous tax credit and a less generous tax credit. And let's compare their outcomes of religious service attendance before and after that was implemented. And what I see happen is that when the amount of the tax credits go up, and the magnitude is something like, if there's a $1,000 increase in your tax return, that means that, or what I find, and I'm interpreting this as a causal result, that religious service attendance drops by about 2 religious services a year or something like that. So a $1,000 increase drops service attendance by about 2 a year. And yeah.
We should probably talk about the big point of your talk, but is that driven by the social service provision? Do you test for like a labor market response? Because the earned income tax credit causes or encourages people to enter the labor market, which could conflict with religious.
Yeah,
service.
there's some labor market response. So what happens, and this is where I wish I had a whiteboard, but there is some labor market responses depending on what phase of the earned income tax credit you're in, especially the. So we do test for that, and for a couple of reasons we don't think it's completely driven by that, although we can't rule that out completely. It doesn't look like the hours work necessarily increases that much. The total earnings tends to, at least in our sample. I'd have to go look at that to at least not a lot, and part of that is the reasons that some of the area that, or how should I say this, some of the earned income tax credit actually has a negative work incentive. So those sort of balance each other out in our sample.
So one of my favorite definitions of economics comes from Jacob Viner, which is that economics is what economists do, which just feels like a blank check, right? Yeah. Like economists, we can do what we want and it makes it economics. Okay, that's not exactly what he means, but applying the theory and the empirical tools that you've suggested. Have you thought about what economists shouldn't do? Have you thought about whether there are things Christian economists shouldn't do or should be particularly interested in doing? Or how broad would you paint the scope of our field?
Yeah, I love that question. I think that I would paint a very broad brush, and I heard something similar one time, and it was a former advisor of mine said, "Well, it's economics if it gets published in an economics journal." And I was like, "Okay, well," and that seemed something like, I don't know, that was a little bit like I don't know, maybe jaded or something, but I think what I personally kind of think about the limits of the economics field, if there's no decision making in it, if there's no decision, it's not economics. Economics has to have somebody making a decision, and there has to be some way that you could think about this decision in terms of costs and benefits. And I think that's where I would, as far as a Christian economist, like what are the limits? And no, I maybe I'm coming up with nothing because I don't really know at this point if there's anything that Christian economists shouldn't study. I know Christian economists that study, repugnant markets, right? Prostitution, crime, right? These are things that are really, really important to know about, though, and they're really important to understand how humans behavior, both from the economics perspective, the discipline of economics, but we also need other social scientists to study this too. We need natural scientists to study this stuff too.
So Neil, thanks, Jeff Tyler, way in the back row here. So thanks for your talk. I was reminded when I went to do my doctorate, I thought, well, this is going to be like undergrad, where there are all these great scholars, even more of them, and at a higher level, all interacting across disciplines and across campus. And I found that they weren't working together at all. And even in their own departments, they weren't working with each other much. And I realized that actually liberal arts colleges are the places where this interaction is occurring, and how special that is. And that it's not happening in many other places in academia. So my theological question, so do you see your economic work as uncovering sort of structures that God has put in place in sort of the fine print of reality? Or do you see yourself as mostly using sort of methods that God has given us ability to use to sort of analyze phenomena? So I guess how deep do you think the economic structures and patterns go?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess like when the rubber meets the road, I've always thought of, I think functionally I've thought about it with the latter, that I'm using I'm using the tools of economics to uncover these relationships. But I think if I sat and thought about it, I mean, I do think there's something about, especially the theoretical insights of economics, there's something about those that, like, does it completely explain human behavior? No, of course not. Is it a pretty decent model? Well, if you judge models by explanatory power, economic models generally do pretty well. They have a lot of explanatory power. They've historically can explain a lot of human behavior. So I think that I often, like, what I tell my classes in principles would be like, if you take a map of the state of Michigan, and it's only useful once you start to strip out like a bunch of unnecessary details, right? So like if you could imagine in the most complicated case where you took an aerial photograph of Michigan, and you just shrunk it down into a size of a map. That would be a very, very accurate map, and it would completely tell you everything about Michigan. But it's not a very useful map, right? And I think economic models kind of can do something like that, where it's not the full picture, but it can kind of tell you the directions. And so I think in the sense that it has explanatory power, yes, I think we are sort of uncovering something that is part of God's design, at least given the set of variables that are on the ground now.